To talk about the process of glazing our projects and the different stages that the clay will go through after we are done sculpting. The first stage is this one right here, and that stage is called bone dry. So a bone dry project is a project that has not been fired at all in the kiln, so it has not been cooked. This is just what it looks like after it sets out for about a week for all of the moisture possible to dry out of it. The stage before this, when it's somewhat workable, you can carve into it, is called leather hard. And that's usually a little bit darker because there's more moisture in there. Depending on what kind of clay you use, these stages might look slightly different. This stage right here is called bisqueware. So this is after it has been fired once in the kiln. The kiln removes all of the moisture from inside the project, and it gives you usually a pretty white appearance because there's no more moisture. Once you have this stage, the bisqueware, you cannot rework a project. It is how it is going to be. And then the last stage, the stage we'll be learning about today, is how to glaze a pot. So this is glazeware right here. There's a few different functions for glaze. One of them is just to give your ceramics a color. Another one is to decorate it, which is kind of the same thing. And then also it will waterproof your projects. Some glazes also will allow for your projects to be heated up or microwaved. Okay, so we're going to learn about how to go from this to this today. I'm going to put this bone dry project away. Okay, so when we glaze, it can sometimes be deceiving because the color of glaze that it looks like when it is wet is not always the color we get once it is done. When we have this in the kiln, it gets so hot that the glaze physically changes and it fuses to the ceramic piece. Reasons for doing this, again, like we said, is they're more functional and also it can add a decorative aspect to it. The tricky thing about glazing is that if we glaze the bottom of the pot and we put it in the kiln and we let that cook, what will happen is the pot will get stuck to the kiln shelf and you will not be able to remove it. They will be fused, they will be one, they will be together. So the only way to get that off of there is to break it. So when we glaze everything on the pot except the bottom. And we can see that with all of my other examples. The bottom is always left unglazed. On occasion, we wouldn't do this in middle school art, but on occasion, you can glaze the bottom if your teacher is using stilts. So a stilt is a little disposable clay piece that you set in there, and you set it on top, and it prevents the clay piece from touching the actual shelf. So once you take this out of the kiln, you break the stilt off and throw away the extra. I've also used the stilts in the past if I have a student who puts too much glaze along the edge and it's kind of creeping in towards the base, then I'll use a stilt just in case so that it doesn't stick. So for example, this one would have been a good one to use a stilt on. So you can see that the glaze is kind of peeking in from the sides, so I would want to be extra careful that won't stick to the shelf, so I would use a stilt for that. Okay, glaze can kind of be deceiving because the color does not always turn out the exact same. For example, this is an amber color. Amber is going to be like a golden to like a dark brown. It depends on how many layers you put on. But as you can see, this kind of looks brownish red. So you have to remember your glaze is not going to always look the same that it does in the bottle from when it is fired. Another important thing with glazing is to make sure you have enough layers. Most glaze calls for about 2 layers to make it look its absolute best. You can see on these different samples we have all kinds of colors and different layers of that color. So on this first one, these ones have only had 1 layer of glaze. You can see the brush strokes on it, you can see the white underneath, and it gives you a very dull color. Okay, this one right here has 3 coats, so you can see the difference between the 3 coats and the 1 coat. And then this one has 2 coats. Looks better than the 1 coat, but not quite as good with the 3 coats. The 3 coats is what is recommended for the kind of glaze that we are using. I wouldn't recommend doing more than 3 coats because sometimes if the glaze gets too thick, it can crack. A lot of the times at the college level or professional level ceramics, instead of painting or brushing on glaze, you dip the pottery. So you dip the project in the glaze and get the glaze on the inside, and you kind of twirl it around. Then you dump that out, and then you dip this down into the glaze and get the glaze all around that way. There are also other things you can do, like apply underglazes. So you could draw on this with an underglaze and then put a clear glaze on top, and it looks like that drawing is behind almost like glass. Okay, so we're just gonna look really quick. This is a pink glaze. A lot of the times, glazes will have a very distinctive odor, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. When you're using the glaze, make sure you're not dipping your brush past the metal part. It just makes a big mess and it wastes the glaze, and glaze is pretty expensive, so we need to be careful. So we're going to dip it in, and we're going to go over the top and get a layer of glaze on there. I'm not actually going to fire this piece, I'm just showing you by example. Okay, so we have 1 layer on there. I'm going to wait a second so you can see how quickly it dries. One mistake I see kids make a lot with their ceramic projects is they do not glaze the top rim of the pot. They usually will glaze the outside and they'll glaze the inside, but they don't glaze that top rim. It's really important to do that. If you're using a different color for the outside as the inside, try not to have the colors overlap on here. Glaze isn't as predictable as paint, for example. So if you had blue on the outside and yellow on the inside, where it overlaps, it usually wouldn't make a green like it would with paint. Usually when you have glaze mixed, it makes kind of a brownish or muddy tone. Another thing that people really struggle with glaze is making sure you get all of the cracks filled in. So if we look at this project that a student did, the green on the way outside looks good. However, if we look into, hold on 1 second. If we look into the cracks right here, you see a lot of white. And you see it here, you see it here. It's also inconsistent how they glaze. So it looks like this only has 1 layer, and then places like here where it maybe dripped have maybe 2 layers on them, so that's why that color is darker. So it's really important to get the full pot glazed. Make sure you get in the little cracks and creases, and then do at least a 2nd layer or a 3rd layer if you have time. It is hard sometimes to get into those little areas, so sometimes we need to use either a smaller brush and get in those little spots, or if you only have a bigger brush available, if you just kind of push in like that, you can a lot of the times get into those little cracks and crevices. Okay, so again, remember, most important thing, not to glaze the bottom. You just want to get the sides, you want to get the top, and you want to get the inside. Also remember, the glaze does not mix like paint does. It will give you kind of an odd color most of the time. Okay, so if we come back to the pink that we're looking at, you can see that it has dried everywhere except where it is a lot thicker, where it kind of got stuck up on there. You can also see you've got little lines on there. That is going to show up similar to how it did on this red if you only did 1 layer of glaze. So now that it's dry, it's time for a 2nd layer. Remember not to get the glaze on the metal. I'm going to go through and get a 2nd layer. If, again, you have time to do the 3rd layer, great. If not, usually a 2nd layer will do it. Okay. To make sure you get every little piece glazed that you want to, It's pretty easier with the darker colors, but when you have lighter colors like pink and white, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the bisqueware, which is white, and then the stuff that you have already glazed. Okay, so once you get your whole project glazed, the inside, the outside, and the lip right here, leaving the bottom unglazed, you can be done. When we glaze fire, I think it gets to about 2,000 degrees, and it usually takes about 2 days. Once I load it, fire it, and then I usually have to let it cool for about a day.